And what Arne Duncan did in Chicago is not unique to Chicago. And in fact, the contours of this program were carried out first under Pinochet in Chile. And this program was implemented by force of military dictatorships and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in Latin America, and the results have been verified by researchers there. They produced increased stratification. So I think what we're seeing right now are the results of that increased stratification, inequality of results. Because if you think about it, No Child Left Behind is almost a decade old. And what are the results? The results are a growing gap between achievement of poor minority kids and those kids who come from prosperous families who live in affluent suburbs and in those suburban schools. And I think it's also very important to understand that this focus on educational reform is a substitute for a jobs policy. Mm-hmm. We need to understand that. Education can democratize the competition for the existing jobs, but it cannot create new jobs. And when most jobs that are being created are by companies like Walmart, education cannot do anything about that. So we really need to look critically at Race to the Top and understand the way that it fits in to this new economic order of a so-called jobless recovery. And that what's really going on is a vocationalization of education, a watering down of curriculum for most kids so that they're going to take jobs that require only a 7th or an 8th grade education, because those are the jobs that are being created in this economy. And so I think that while it's important to look at the particulars of each state and each city, each school district, it's also important to see this large picture, because almost anything that you can point to me that's being done in Chicago or New York or San Francisco, we can find another place in the world that it was already done, and we can look at those results, and the results are not good.
But those who are at the forefront of this so-called reform movement say that the charter schools that they're creating, the small schools that they're creating, are doing a better job by the testing model of educating children, especially minority children, than has occurred in decades past under the existing public school system. What's your response to that?
My response to that, first of all, is that I want to see the evidence. And what's really incredible and disastrous is that this enormous social engineering that's going on to transform, I would say destroy, public education has not been accompanied by government funding for serious objective evaluation. We have this so-called Institute for Education Science, but if you look at the sorts of research that they're funding, they are not funding the kind of large-scale evaluative studies that we need to determine whether these reforms are going to be effective. And we shouldn't permit that. We should identify this as what it is, which is an ideological venture that does not have a scientific basis, and it doesn't have a basis in evidence.
You've also taken a look at the impact of No Child Left Behind on teachers. Could you talk about that?
Well, I think it's important to understand that there are No Child Left Behind is part of this global project to deprofessionalize teaching as an occupation. And the reason that it's important in this project to deprofessionalize teaching is that the thinking is that the biggest expenditure in education is teacher salaries. And they want to cut costs. They want to diminish the amount of money that's put into public education. And that means they have to lower teacher costs. And in order to do that, they have to deprofessionalize teaching. They have to make it a revolving door. in which we're not going to pay teachers very much. They're not going to stay very long. We're going to credential them really fast. They're going to go in. We're going to burn them up. They're going to leave in 3, 4, 5 years. And that's the model that they want. So who is the biggest impediment to that occurring? Teachers' unions. And that is what explains this massive propaganda effort to say that teachers' unions are an impediment to reform. And in fact, they are an impediment to the deprofessionalization of teaching, which I think is a disaster. It's a disaster for public education.
Well, you know, I've been for several years now looking deeply into these charter schools and especially their tax forms. And one of the things that has struck me as I look at their various audited financial statements is that, generally speaking, the pay levels of the teachers in the charter schools are far lower than they are for normal public school teachers. But the pay of the executives of the charter schools is far higher than it is for superintendents. So you're, in essence, creating a much bigger wage gap in the schools through the charters between management and the employees who actually cover the work. I'm wondering what you found.
Part of the, that's part of the thinking here, that teaching really does not have to be a skilled profession, because we're not going to educate kids to do anything more than work in Walmart or the equivalent. They only need a 7th or an 8th grade education, at most a 9th grade education. And so we don't need teachers who are more than, as Grover Whitehurst, a former Undersecretary of Education, said, good enough. That's all we need, is teachers who are good enough to follow scripted curriculum and to teach to these standardized tests. And if you only need teachers who are good enough, you don't have to pay them very much. And that's the project. And regardless of the rhetoric, regardless of the intentions of some of the people who are supporting these reforms, people like the Education Trust, whose work I respect, I think it's important that we look at something beyond the intentions and the rhetoric, and we really look at this project as being a project that's global in its nature.